G'day folks, and welcome to this introduction to the 1937 The Rising Sun scenario. This is the first two-map campaign game scenario. It starts at the earliest possible time, March, April 1937, and it potentially runs through until, I guess, potentially 1948. Unlikely, but that's the long-term potential. Ideally, the Japanese are trying to achieve an automatic victory by seizing sufficient strategic hexes without losing any of their Axis strategic hexes. Those hexes are all the green hexes you can see on the board. So there's quite a few throughout China, Balikpapan in Borneo, Davao, Rabaul, of course Townsville, Sydney, a few throughout the Pacific. The Japanese are aiming for those strategic objectives without losing their own Axis objectives, and that's the way they win. They will probably start with a bit of the initiative in terms of a stronger force pool, stronger forces on the board, leading their offensives, whilst the Allies, again, as is often the case with Southeast Asian Pacific Theatre of Operation games, are gradually kind of waiting and building up their forces and trying to organise a defence against Japanese expansion. So I have gone through the learning scenarios, and you may have seen my learning scenario videos and my learning diary where I've understood the basics of gameplay. Those learning scenarios teach you the fundamentals of how the game works, how the sequence of play works, how movement works, how option cards all work. These campaign scenarios, as I'm very just that set up here, but I'm learning and understanding the importance of decision making relating to these decks. This is the Japanese pre-war deck of options cards, and there's a lot of possibilities here for the Japanese to pursue many different paths to victory. About 18 cards, all giving you different options, all driving different events, all shaping Japanese strategy in different way. And this is until they get to Limited War, where we then add their Limited War deck, and then Total War, where we have their Total War deck, and they have these very powerful offensive capabilities. For now, though, we basically, the Japanese get this deck, the Western forces get their corresponding deck, so too with the Soviets, and they need to decide what to do. I'm also thinking about broader strategic plans. So the Japanese, what I learnt from those learning scenarios was that you really need military superiority to defeat your opponents. The combat results table really doesn't favour low odds very well. Even a 2-to-1 attack gives you anything higher than a 2 is basically unsuccessful. So you need at least a 3-to-1. This is where you start to get to DR, defender retreat for 5 out of the 6 options. So this is the ideal column for combat, which requires substantial superiority of forces, which means lots of Japanese infantry steps making their way into Manchukuo. And I want that numerical superiority before I begin to take on Hopei and Kiangsu on the sort of eastern coast of China. Thus, there's a really strong impetus on the Japanese to build up their forces in Manchukuo. You notice no forces in Japan, not much in Shanghai, but a single 2-step unit, a couple of garrisons and detachments spread elsewhere throughout the Pacific. So 1937, I think, is going to be the story of a slow and gradual, well, as fast as I can, Japanese build-up of forces. I don't know what the Western forces and the Soviet forces are going to do to respond to this. I guess they're going to try to build up their force pool as much as they can. But to a large extent, they're responding to what the Japanese are doing. And whilst the Japanese are being relatively passive in rearming and putting up these steps and not engaging in any kind of direct confrontation, there's not a lot the Western and Soviet forces can do. So with everything set up, with the 3 starting options cards selected, being a bit preemptive here. Technically only the Axis need to select their card first. But with that done, I guess we get into it, and I'll report back soon on how this scenario plays out and how the Japanese fare in their expansionist plans.